The winter evening of February 14th started like any other Tuesday in the suburban neighborhood of Riverside, Colorado. 3-year-old Emma sat on the living room floor, surrounded by her collection of colorful building blocks and stuffed animals. She was a cheerful, curious child with golden ringlets and bright blue eyes that seemed to sparkle with innocent wonder about the world around her. Her mother, Sarah, prepared dinner in the kitchen while humming softly, a routine that had repeated itself countless times. Emma giggled as she stacked her blocks higher and higher, creating what she imagined was a magnificent castle. The television played softly in the background, and the house was warm and filled with the comforting aroma of homemade spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove. Everything changed in an instant when the front door burst open violently. Emma's father, Michael, stormed into the house, his face flushed with anger, his body trembling with rage. He had lost his job that day, a position he'd held for 8 years at a manufacturing company. The rejection and humiliation had been building inside him all afternoon, festering like an untreated wound. He'd stopped at a bar on the way home, drowning his sorrows in alcohol, which only amplified his anger and lowered his inhibitions. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, sensing immediately that something was terribly wrong. The expression on Michael's face was one she'd never seen before, dark, menacing, and utterly terrifying. What happened next would forever change the trajectory of young Emma's life. Michael's rage exploded in a violent tirade. He threw objects across the living room, the lamp that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, family photographs in their frames, decorative items carefully arranged on shelves. His voice became a thunderous roar that shook the very walls of their home. Sarah tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but her words only seemed to fuel his fury further. Emma, frozen in terror, watched from her spot on the floor, her building blocks forgotten, her innocent mind struggling to comprehend the chaos unfolding before her eyes. The sounds were deafening, glass breaking, furniture crashing, her father's voice rising to inhuman volumes, her mother's desperate pleas for him to stop. Sarah, driven by pure maternal instinct and protective love, grabbed Emma from the floor and ran. She didn't think about collecting belongings or calling for help in that moment. Her only focus was getting her daughter away from the violence. She clutched Emma tightly against her chest, feeling her daughter's tiny body trembling violently, her small heart beating frantically. Sarah ran upstairs to their bedroom, locked the door, and held Emma close, whispering reassurances that she desperately hoped would protect her child from the psychological damage of what she was witnessing. But even with the door locked and the distance created, they could still hear the destruction continuing downstairs. Emma's screams mixed with her father's furious roars, creating a symphony of terror that would echo in both their minds for years to come. The police arrived 30 minutes later, called by a concerned neighbor who had heard the commotion from next door. By the time they arrived, Michael had collapsed on the living room floor, his rage spent, his energy depleted. Officers found Sarah and Emma huddled together in the upstairs bedroom. Emma was no longer screaming. Instead, she had gone completely silent, her eyes staring blankly ahead. This silence was somehow more disturbing than the screams had been. The officers gently separated mother and daughter so they could assess both for injuries. Emma had no physical wounds, but her psychological state was immediately evident to everyone present. She didn't respond to questions, didn't acknowledge the officer's presence, and clung to her mother with a desperation that suggested she believed letting go might mean losing her forever. The weeks following the incident were devastating for the entire family. Emma's personality completely transformed. The cheerful, curious toddler who had loved exploring the world and meeting new people became withdrawn and fearful. She experienced night terrors so severe that she would wake up screaming, covered in sweat, her mother's arms the only thing that could calm her. During the day, she barely ate, picking at her food with no appetite or interest. She refused to play with toys that had once brought her joy. Loud noises, the vacuum cleaner, the doorbell, even the sound of traffic outside, would send her into a panic state where she would scream and cry uncontrollably for minutes afterward. Sarah noticed that Emma had begun flinching at sudden movements, even when they were gentle and non-threatening. If someone moved too quickly near her or raised their voice even slightly, Emma would shrink back, her eyes widening with fear. She refused to make eye contact with strangers and would hide behind her mother's legs whenever anyone tried to interact with her. Other children reported that Emma didn't want to play with them anymore. Instead, she would sit alone in corners, rocking back and forth, her thumb in her mouth, completely disconnected from the world around her. Sarah took Emma to see Dr., a child psychologist specializing in trauma and early childhood development. After several sessions of observation and evaluation, Dr. delivered the diagnosis that Sarah had feared: severe post-traumatic stress disorder combined with generalized anxiety disorder. The psychologist explained that Emma had witnessed something her developing brain couldn't properly process. At only 3 years old, Emma lacked the cognitive framework to understand that the violence she witnessed wasn't her fault, that she hadn't caused it, and that it didn't mean the world was fundamentally unsafe. Every instinct in her young body now perceived danger in normal situations. The road ahead seemed impossibly long and uncertain. Sarah felt the weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders, even though the violence wasn't her fault. She second-guessed every decision. Should she have left Michael sooner? Should she have recognized the warning signs of his unstable mental health? These questions haunted her during the sleepless nights when Emma's nightmares kept them both awake. Sarah's own trauma was compounded by watching her precious daughter suffer, knowing that she couldn't simply kiss away her daughter's fears like she could with scraped knees or minor childhood disappointments. The custody hearing loomed on the horizon like a dark storm cloud. The court needed to determine whether Michael should have any contact with Emma, what type of custody arrangement would be best for the child, and what protective measures needed to be implemented. Sarah knew that Emma would likely need to testify or at least be present during the proceedings. The thought terrified her. How could she put her traumatized daughter through the ordeal of a courtroom? Yet the legal system required her presence, her voice, her truth. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The outcome of this hearing would determine whether Emma would have any contact with the man who had caused her such profound fear and pain. As February turned to March, Sarah held on to hope that somehow, some way, things would get better. She didn't know how, but she refused to give up on her daughter's recovery. That hope would soon be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. March arrived in Colorado with unpredictable weather. Some days brought warm sunshine that hinted at spring, while others delivered late-season snowstorms that reminded residents that winter wasn't quite finished. Sarah sat in Doctor's office for their weekly session, feeling increasingly desperate as she watched her daughter show minimal progress despite weeks of professional therapy. Emma sat in the corner of the therapist's colorful playroom, arranging and rearranging the same 3 toy blocks, her face expressionless, her movements mechanical and repetitive. Doctor observed from her comfortable chair, making notes and occasionally asking gentle questions that Emma either ignored or answered in barely audible whispers. Sarah felt the weight of helplessness pressing down on her chest. She had tried everything the therapist recommended, creating safe spaces, maintaining consistent routines, using calming techniques, being patient and compassionate. Yet Emma seemed to be withdrawing further rather than improving. The nightmares continued with relentless frequency. Emma still wouldn't eat properly, had lost weight, and seemed to have aged emotionally beyond her 3 years. Sarah wondered sometimes if her daughter would ever truly recover from what she had witnessed. The thought that Emma might carry this trauma forever was almost unbearable. After the session ended, Sarah gathered Emma and prepared to leave. As they approached the reception desk, Doctor called Sarah back into her office. The psychologist closed the door quietly, her expression serious but hopeful. She explained that she had been researching emerging therapeutic interventions for severely traumatized children and had come across something remarkable, a program that was changing lives across the country. She pulled up information on her computer and turned the screen toward Sarah. "Have you heard of courtroom support dogs?" Doctor asked gently. Sarah shook her head, unfamiliar with the concept. The psychologist continued, explaining that certain dogs underwent extensive training to work with children who had experienced trauma, abuse, or other significant psychological injuries. These weren't ordinary therapy pets. They were specially selected animals that demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence, unwavering calm under pressure, and an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was experiencing distress or anxiety. The dogs were specifically trained to provide nonverbal emotional support during legal proceedings, which for many traumatized children were experiences. The courtroom environment, with its formal atmosphere, intimidating authority figures, aggressive questioning, and emotional content, could trigger severe panic responses in children who had already been harmed. However, when a trained support dog was present, studies showed remarkable results. Children were more likely to speak truthfully about their experiences, experienced fewer panic symptoms, and seemed to access courage they didn't know they possessed. Sarah listened to Doctor describe case after case of traumatized children who had found their voices through the presence of a calm, supportive canine companion. The psychologist explained that the dog's presence activated certain neural pathways in the brain that promoted feelings of safety and connection. When a child felt scared or overwhelmed, they could focus on the dog instead of their fear, finding an anchor point of stability in the chaos of the courtroom. "I know this might seem unconventional," Doctor said, "but I truly believe this could help Emma, and more importantly, she deserves every possible advantage as she faces her upcoming testimony. Will you at least look into it?" Sarah left the office with a stack of information about the program. She read through the materials that evening after Emma had finally fallen asleep. There were testimonials from other parents describing transformations similar to what she desperately hoped for Emma. One mother had written, "My daughter hadn't spoken a word for 6 months. With the support dog, she clearly and confidently. It was like witnessing a miracle." Another parent described how their child had gone from being unable to enter a courtroom without having a complete meltdown to actually being able to complete their testimony and participate in their own healing process. Sarah began researching the program more thoroughly, spending hours on her computer after Emma was asleep. She discovered that the Riverside County Courthouse had recently implemented a courtroom support dog program, specifically designed for cases involving child trauma, abuse, and neglect. The program was relatively new but had already demonstrated impressive results. There was a waiting list, but Sarah's situation, with the custody hearing scheduled for late April, made her a priority case. She filled out the application forms with trembling hands, describing Emma's condition, her behavioral changes, and her fears about the upcoming hearing. She included letters from Doctor and Emma's pediatrician, both of whom strongly recommended the program. Sarah wrote about her hopes and fears, her desperation for her daughter to heal, and her willingness to try anything that might help Emma find her voice again. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call from the courthouse. A program coordinator named explained that Emma had been accepted into the courtroom support dog program. His voice was warm and encouraging, filled with genuine compassion for the situation. She explained that they had a remarkable dog named Officer Max, a German Shepherd with 6 years of law enforcement and support work experience. Officer Max had been part of the program since its inception and had an exceptional success rate with young children. Suggested that Sarah and Emma come to the courthouse the day before the hearing to meet Officer Max in a controlled, non-threatening environment. This preliminary meeting would allow Emma and the dog to become familiar with each other, to establish a connection before the high-stress situation of the actual hearing. Emphasized that this initial meeting was absolutely crucial to the success of the support work. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest when she hung up the phone. For the first time in months, genuine hope flickered to life. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that a dog could magically erase Emma's trauma or make her completely comfortable testifying about the most frightening experience of her young life. But maybe, just maybe, this dog could provide enough emotional support for Emma to access the courage she needed. Maybe Officer Max could be the bridge Emma needed to cross from fear and silence into healing and truth. That night, Sarah told Emma about the dog she would meet. She used gentle, positive language, describing Max as a special friend who would help her feel brave and safe. Emma didn't respond with her usual enthusiastic response to stories about animals. She still had that quality, but Sarah thought she saw the tiniest spark of curiosity flicker across her daughter's face. Sarah spent the next week preparing Emma emotionally, talking about the courthouse visit, about Officer Max, about how the dog would be there to help her. She showed Emma pictures of German Shepherds online, speaking about them in calm, reassuring tones. She read stories about brave dogs and brave children, trying to plant seeds of possibility in Emma's traumatized mind. As the day of the meeting approached, Sarah found herself alternating between hope and anxiety. What if the dog didn't help? What if Emma had a negative reaction? What if nothing worked and Emma still couldn't testify? But underneath those fears was something stronger, a mother's fierce determination that her daughter would not be defined by this trauma forever. If a dog could help Emma find her voice again, Sarah would move heaven and earth to make that happen. The morning of the courthouse visit arrived with brilliant spring sunshine streaming through Emma's bedroom window. Sarah had dressed her daughter carefully, choosing the pink dress that Emma had always loved, a soft, comfortable garment with white lace trim that made her feel special and safe. Sarah had even braided Emma's golden hair with matching pink ribbons, creating an appearance of innocence and vulnerability that seemed to armor her against the harsh realities she would soon face. Emma was unusually quiet that morning, sensing perhaps that something significant was about to happen, though she couldn't have understood the magnitude of what awaited her. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through the winding streets of Riverside. Sarah kept the radio tuned to a soft classical music station, the kind of gentle background noise that seemed to calm Emma's anxious energy. As they drove, Sarah spoke in her most reassuring voice about Officer Max, describing him as a very special dog with an important job, helping children feel safe and brave. She explained that Max was a police dog, which made him extra special and extra smart. Emma stared out the window, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress, her blue eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and cautious curiosity. The Riverside County Courthouse was an imposing structure of gray stone and tall windows, the kind of building designed to inspire respect and intimidate those who entered. Sarah had always felt somewhat nervous in courthouses, sensing the weight of justice and authority that permeated the spaces. She wondered how terrifying it must feel to a 3-year-old child who had already experienced betrayal and violence from an adult she had trusted. The program coordinator greeted them in the courthouse lobby with a warm smile that immediately put Sarah at ease. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore comfortable clothing rather than formal business attire, which seemed intentional, designed not to intimidate children or add to the atmosphere of authority and fear that the courthouse naturally projected. Knelt down to Emma's level, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to startle the already nervous child. "Hello, Emma," said in a soft, gentle voice. "I'm so happy to meet you. I have someone very special I'd like you to meet today. His name is Officer Max, and he's a really wonderful dog. Would you like to meet him?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she glanced at her mother, seeking reassurance. Sarah nodded encouragingly and squeezed Emma's hand gently, led them down a hallway to a comfortable room that had been designed specifically for these preliminary meetings. It was decorated in soft, calming colors, pale blues and greens with natural light flooding through large windows. There were cushioned chairs, soft rugs, and toys scattered about, creating an environment that felt more like a comfortable home than an intimidating institutional space. Officer Max's handler, stood near the window with the dog on a loose leash. Officer Max was a magnificent German shepherd, his coat a rich tan and black coloring that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. He was large, probably 80 pounds of muscle and fur, but something about his demeanor conveyed gentleness rather than aggression. His brown eyes were intelligent and aware, constantly scanning the environment and reading the emotional energy of those around him. As soon as entered the room, Max's tail began to wag slowly, a measured movement that suggested calm confidence rather than excitable enthusiasm. Officer introduced himself to Sarah with a professional handshake and warm greeting. He was a man in his 40s with an athletic build and a calm presence that suggested he had spent years working in high-stress situations. His uniform bore patches indicating his law enforcement credentials, but the way he held himself, relaxed, open, non-threatening, conveyed that he was someone who could be trusted. Officer Max has been working in our program for 3 years, Officer explained to Sarah, keeping his voice at a conversational level while maintaining eye contact. He has an exceptional ability to sense when children are experiencing anxiety or fear. He's been trained to provide comfort through his presence without being intrusive or overwhelming. What's remarkable about Max is that he seems to understand exactly what each child needs in each moment. Sarah watched as Officer demonstrated some of Officer Max's trained behaviors. He showed how Max could sit on command, lie down, and respond to various verbal cues. But more importantly, he demonstrated Max's comfort behaviors, how the dog would gently rest his head on someone's lap, how he could position himself to provide physical comfort, and how he could remain perfectly calm and attentive even when presented with stressful stimuli. Throughout this demonstration, Officer gradually moved closer to Emma. He didn't force interaction or rush the process. Instead, he simply allowed his presence and Max's presence to become more familiar to the little girl. Emma watched the dog with a mixture of fear and fascination, her small body still tense but her eyes never leaving Max's form. "Emma," Officer said quietly, addressing her directly, "Max really wants to be your friend. But Max knows that you might feel scared right now, so he's going to wait. He's very patient. Would it be okay if Max just sat here nearby while you and your mom get comfortable?" Officer guided Max to sit about 6 feet away from Emma, maintaining that respectful distance that didn't feel overwhelming or threatening. Max settled into a perfect sit position, his body relaxed, his expression calm and patient. Sarah noticed that Max's ears were slightly forward, indicating his attention was focused on Emma, but his overall demeanor conveyed no pressure or urgency. Sarah and Emma sat down on one of the cushioned chairs. Sarah kept her arm around her daughter, providing physical reassurance and a sense of security. They sat together in silence for several minutes, simply allowing Emma to observe Officer Max from a distance where she felt safe. Gradually, Sarah noticed the tension in Emma's small body beginning to decrease slightly. The dog's complete lack of aggressive energy seemed to gradually penetrate Emma's fear-based defenses. After about 15 minutes of quiet observation, Officer spoke again, his voice maintaining the same calm, unhurried tone. "Emma, I'm going to give Max a treat now. Would you like to see that?" Emma didn't answer verbally, but she shifted slightly forward, indicating interest. Officer produced a small training treat and gave it to Max, who accepted it gently from his handler's hand. The action was simple but significant. It demonstrated that this was a dog who responded to commands, who had discipline and training, who was fundamentally safe and controllable. "Max really loves to rest his head on people's laps," Officer continued. "When he does that, it helps children feel calmer, but Max won't do anything until you're ready. He's very good at waiting." Sarah felt Emma's grip on her hand relax infinitesimally. Something about the dog's peaceful presence was beginning to work its magic on the traumatized child. Officer stood up and moved to speak with and Sarah, allowing Emma to continue observing Max at her own pace. As Sarah listened to Officer explain Max's training and capabilities, she watched her daughter's face. For the first time in months, she saw a hint of genuine curiosity, not the fearful, defensive kind, but real interest in the animal before her. Emma's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid when they first entered the room, had normalized. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, had dropped slightly. Then something unexpected happened. Emma, still holding her mother's hand but with increasing confidence, extended her other hand slightly toward Officer Max. The movement was tentative, uncertain, but it was brave. A 3-year-old child who had learned to fear most things in the world making an overture of connection. Officer Max, reading the signal perfectly through years of training and natural instinct, did exactly the right thing. He didn't surge forward or become overly enthusiastic. Instead, he slowly and deliberately lowered his head and moved it slightly in Emma's direction, closing the distance with measured patience. When his head was close enough, Emma's small fingers made contact with his fur. What happened in that moment was extraordinary. Emma's face transformed. Her eyes widened in what appeared to be wonder rather than fear. Her lips curved upward in what might have been the very beginning of a smile. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but to Sarah it was like witnessing the sun breaking through storm clouds. Emma's rigid posture relaxed as she continued to gently pet Officer Max's head, her small hand moving cautiously through his soft fur. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She had been so focused on Emma's trauma, her withdrawal, her fear, that she had almost forgotten what her daughter's natural curiosity and capacity for connection looked like. Officer Max, through his trained presence and genuine gentleness, had somehow created a bridge across the chasm of fear that had separated Emma from the rest of the world. Officer smiled knowingly. "Max is already working his magic," he said quietly to Sarah. "I have a feeling these two are going to form a very special bond." The evening of Emma's meeting with Officer Max was unlike any other evening Sarah had experienced in months. After leaving the courthouse, she had taken Emma to a small ice cream parlor as a reward for being so brave during the introduction to the dog. Emma had chosen strawberry ice cream, her favorite flavor, and while she ate it slowly and didn't finish the entire serving, she had engaged with the treat in a way that suggested genuine enjoyment rather than the mechanical, disinterested consumption that had characterized her eating habits since the traumatic incident. During the drive home, Emma had remained unusually quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than her usual withdrawn silence. This silence seemed contemplative rather than fearful, as if her young mind was processing the profound experience of connecting with Officer Max. Sarah had replayed the moment of connection over and over in her mind. That first gentle touch, the way Emma's face had transformed, the spark of something that looked remarkably like hope igniting in her daughter's frightened eyes. As evening descended and Sarah began Emma's bedtime routine, she found herself filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Tomorrow was the day of the custody hearing, the day when Emma would need to speak about the most traumatic experience of her short life, the day when she would need to testify in front of a judge, lawyers, and possibly her father, the day when the entire legal system would depend on her ability to communicate what she had witnessed and experienced. It was an enormous weight to place on the shoulders of a 3-year-old child. Sarah gave Emma a warm bath, using the gentle bubble bath that Emma had once loved but had shown no interest in for months. Tonight, however, Emma seemed to appreciate the sensation of warm water and soft bubbles. She didn't splash or play as she once had, but she didn't resist or seem frightened by the experience either. Sarah washed her daughter's golden hair carefully, whispering soft words of reassurance and love. "Tomorrow is a very important day," Sarah said gently as she rinsed the soap from Emma's hair. "You're going to go to the courthouse again, and Officer Max is going to be there with you. Remember how nice Officer Max was, how he let you pet his soft fur." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the bubbles floating in the bathwater. Sarah's heart ached at the seriousness in her daughter's expression, the weight of understanding that something significant was about to happen, even if Emma couldn't fully comprehend the legal and emotional complexities involved. After the bath, Sarah dressed Emma in her favorite pajamas, soft, pale pink cotton decorated with images of sleeping stars and crescent moons. She braided Emma's damp hair loosely, creating a style that would keep the golden strands neat overnight. The simple act of brushing and braiding Emma's hair had always been a source of comfort for both of them, a quiet moment of bonding and tenderness in the midst of their chaotic lives. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed, she sat on the edge of the mattress and took her daughter's small hand in her own. She looked at her child, this tiny, fragile person who had been through so much, and felt the weight of her own responsibility as a mother. She had brought Emma into a world where violence existed, where trust could be shattered, where safety was not guaranteed. The guilt that always lurked at the edges of Sarah's consciousness rose up again, but she pushed it aside. Emma needed her to be strong now. "I'm so proud of you," Sarah whispered, squeezing Emma's hand gently. "You were so brave today when you met Officer Max. Tomorrow you're going to be brave again. Officer Max will be right there with you and Mommy will be there too. We're going to help you tell the truth about what happened that night. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes, which had been starting to close as sleep approached, opened again. She nodded slightly, though Sarah wasn't certain how much her daughter actually understood about the magnitude of what was to come. Emma brought her small thumb to her mouth, a self-soothing gesture that had returned since the trauma. Sarah didn't correct her, recognizing that her daughter needed whatever comfort mechanism she could access. "Officer Max is going to help you feel brave and safe," Sarah continued, stroking Emma's hair gently. "Just like he helped you today. And you know what? I think Officer Max really, really likes you. I think you two are going to be very good friends." A ghost of that small smile, the one that had appeared during the meeting with Officer Max, flickered across Emma's face. Sarah held onto that image, that tiny indication that her daughter was still in there, still capable of connection and hope, still able to find moments of peace amidst the trauma that threatened to consume her. Sarah left Emma's room and went to her own bedroom. She knew she should try to sleep. Tomorrow would be emotionally and physically demanding for both of them, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind raced with anxiety and worry. What if Emma froze during the testimony? What if she became too overwhelmed to speak? What if the presence of Officer Max wasn't enough to overcome her fear? What if the judge didn't believe her? What if Michael's lawyers managed to discredit or confuse Emma's testimony? Sarah pulled up the files on her laptop, the photographs of the destroyed living room taken by police officers, the medical reports documenting Emma's trauma symptoms, the psychological evaluations from Dr. She reviewed the detailed statements she herself had given to law enforcement, going over the facts of that terrible evening again and again. She had told this story so many times that it had begun to feel surreal, disconnected from her lived experience, as if she was reading about someone else's tragedy. Around midnight, Sarah made herself a cup of chamomile tea, hoping the warm beverage might calm her racing mind. She sat by the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet street bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in the darkness, in a secure training facility, Officer Max was probably sleeping peacefully, unaware of the crucial role he would play in a child's healing and in the pursuit of justice. Sarah thought about the handler officer and the way he had spoken about Max with such obvious affection and respect. The man clearly believed in what this dog could do, believed in his ability to help traumatized children access their courage and strength. That belief had begun to transfer to Sarah as well. Maybe, just maybe, this remarkable dog could provide the emotional bridge Emma needed. At 2 in the morning, Sarah finally gave up on sleep. She pulled out a journal that doctor had recommended she keep and began writing. She wrote about her fears, her hopes, her desperate prayers that somehow everything would work out in a way that protected Emma and allowed her to heal. She wrote about the moment Emma had touched Officer Max and how that single moment had felt like a turning point. She wrote letters to Emma that she might never share, expressing her love and her sorrow that her daughter had to endure any of this. By the time the sun began to rise on the morning of the hearing, Sarah was exhausted but strangely calm. She had moved through the night like a person in a dream, and now reality was approaching with the inevitable force of dawn. She showered and dressed carefully, choosing professional but warm clothing. She wanted to project competence and stability to the court while also conveying the genuine vulnerability of a mother fighting to protect her child. In Emma's room, her daughter was still sleeping, her small face peaceful in the early morning light. Sarah watched her sleep, committing every detail to memory. The way Emma's golden hair spread across the pillow, the slight parting of her lips, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. Whatever happened today, Sarah wanted to remember this moment of peace before everything changed. As 6:30 approached, Sarah gently woke Emma. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered. "Today is the day we see Officer Max again. Are you ready to be brave?" Emma's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then recognition and awareness returned. She reached for her mother, and Sarah held her close, feeling the rapid beating of her daughter's heart against her own chest. They held each other in the quiet of dawn, mother and daughter, preparing together for what awaited them in the courthouse. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Riverside County Courthouse as Sarah and Emma approached the imposing wooden doors. Emma was dressed in the same pink dress she had worn the day before, the one that made her feel brave and special. Her golden hair was freshly braided with pink ribbons, and she clutched a small stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her since infancy, her most treasured possession and her most reliable source of comfort. Sarah had permitted Emma to bring the rabbit today, recognizing that this small connection to normalcy and comfort would be essential in the hours ahead. The courthouse hallways felt different in the morning light than they had during yesterday's visit. The building seemed to pulse with a kind of institutional authority that was impossible to ignore. Other people moved through the corridors with purposeful strides, lawyers in dark suits carrying leather briefcases, court officers in uniform, other families navigating their own legal crises. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of justice, judgment, and life-altering decisions. Sarah felt Emma's hand grip hers more tightly as they walked. Her daughter's small body was tense, her breathing already becoming more rapid and shallow. Emma could sense, even without fully understanding, that something momentous was about to happen. The energy in the building was so different from anywhere else they had been. It vibrated with a kind of formal authority that was intimidating even to adults, let alone to a traumatized 3-year-old child. Met them in the corridor outside the courtroom, her warm smile providing a small oasis of kindness in the sterile institutional environment. She was accompanied by Officer and Officer Max. The German Shepherd's presence immediately seemed to transform the atmosphere around them. Even in the formal hallway of the courthouse, with its high ceilings and echoing sounds, Officer Max's calm demeanor created a pocket of peaceful energy. "Good morning, Emma," said warmly, kneeling down to the child's level. "Officer Max is so happy to see you again. He's been thinking about you all morning. Did you know that?" Emma looked at Officer Max with wide eyes, her grip on her mother's hand relaxing fractionally. The dog's tail wagged slowly, a measured movement that conveyed gentle friendliness rather than overwhelming enthusiasm. Officer Max approached Emma with the same careful, deliberate movements that had characterized their first meeting. He allowed Emma to maintain control of the interaction, letting her decide the pace and intensity of their connection. Officer stood quietly nearby, his presence a reassuring constant. He had explained to Sarah the night before that today his role would be to remain as unobtrusive as possible, allowing Emma's focus to be entirely on the dog rather than on the handler or the formal legal procedures surrounding them. "Emma," Officer said in his calm, measured voice, "Officer Max is going to be right with you in the courtroom today. He's going to sit next to you, and whenever you need to feel brave, you can pet his fur or lean against him. Officer Max is very good at helping children feel safe. He understands what you're going through, and he wants to help you." Sarah watched her daughter process this information. Emma's eyes moved between Officer Max's calm face and her mother's encouraging expression. The dog represented hope, safety, and connection in an environment that otherwise threatened to overwhelm the child with fear and confusion. Guided them to a small waiting room adjacent to the courtroom. This room had been designed to prepare witnesses and family members before they entered the courtroom proper. It was decorated in soothing colors and contained comfortable seating, water coolers, and tissues for those whose emotions became too overwhelming. Through the open doorway, Sarah could see the preparation taking place inside the courtroom, officers arranging chairs, lawyers settling at their respective tables, court staff preparing documents and recording equipment. Inside the waiting room, Sarah sat with Emma while Officer Max remained nearby, his presence providing an invisible emotional anchor. Sarah had dressed carefully that morning, selecting clothing that conveyed both professional competence and vulnerability. She wore a navy blue blazer over a cream-colored blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat style, her makeup applied carefully to look composed despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. Their family law attorney entered the waiting room carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and an expression of calm determination that immediately inspired confidence. She had been practicing family law for 25 years and had handled countless custody cases, but she approached each one with the seriousness it deserved. She greeted Sarah and Emma with warmth, kneeling down to speak briefly with Emma in a gentle, age-appropriate way. "Emma, I'm here to help you and your mom today," she said. "Today, we're going to talk to a very important person called a judge. The judge's job is to make sure that you stay safe and happy. You're going to tell the judge about what happened that night when Daddy got very angry. Do you think you can do that?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she nodded slightly, her small hand still holding her stuffed rabbit. Spoke to Sarah next, reviewing the legal strategy one final time. She explained that the judge would likely ask Emma to sit in a special chair called the witness stand, where she would speak about what she had witnessed. Would ask her questions first, friendly questions designed to help Emma feel comfortable speaking. Then the opposing counsel would have the opportunity to cross-examine Emma, which warned might be more aggressive or challenging. But with Officer Max present, said, glancing at the dog with clear approval, "I believe Emma will have the emotional resources to handle the questioning. The presence of the support dog has been documented in numerous cases to significantly improve a child's ability to testify." At 10:30, signaled that it was time. The courtroom doors were heavy and imposing, covered in dark wood and featuring brass handles worn smooth by decades of use. As they approached the doors, Sarah felt her heart rate increase dramatically. This was it. This was the moment when Emma would step into the formal legal system and be asked to bear witness to her own trauma. Officer led Officer Max through the doors first, allowing the dog to acclimate to the courtroom environment. Sarah entered next, holding Emma's hand firmly but gently. Behind them came, and various court officers and support staff. The courtroom itself was larger and more imposing than Sarah had expected, with high ceilings and wood paneling that created an atmosphere of institutional authority and seriousness. The judge sat elevated on a large wooden bench at the front of the room, Judge Harrison, a man in his 60s with gray hair and a stern expression that suggested he had seen countless cases and the darker aspects of human nature. His black robes draped around him like the vestments of a priest presiding over sacred rituals. The judge looked down from his elevated position with an expression of grave seriousness as the parties entered. The opposing counsel, Michael's attorney, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit named Richard, sat at the other table, his body language conveying professional confidence and a certain aggressive energy. Sarah's anxiety spiked as she observed him. This man would be trying to discredit her daughter's testimony, to cast doubt on her recollections, to undermine the narrative that would protect Emma and validate Sarah's custody claims. Court reporters sat at their stations, fingers poised over keyboards ready to record every word spoken in this room. Bailiffs stood at attention, their uniforms and weapons conveying the authority of the state. Gallery seating held a handful of observers, other family members involved in various legal proceedings, court watchers, and individuals waiting for their own cases to be called. Emma froze as she took in the enormity of the courtroom, her small body rigid with fear. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and her eyes widened to an almost frightening degree. She was on the verge of a panic attack. Sarah could see it developing in real time. This was the moment of truth. This was when Officer Max's training, presence, and bond with Emma would either work or fail. Officer Max, sensing Emma's escalating distress with the almost supernatural awareness that had been trained and refined over years of work with traumatized children, moved closer to the girl. The dog positioned himself between Emma and the overwhelming stimuli of the courtroom, creating a physical and emotional barrier that helped Emma focus on something safe and familiar rather than on all the frightening elements surrounding her. Judge Harrison observed this interaction with interest, his stern expression softening slightly as he watched the dog's deliberate, protective positioning. He made a note on a document before him, his pen scratching across the paper. "We're ready to begin," Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the courtroom with authoritative weight. "But first, I'd like to address the presence of the support animal. Officer, would you please explain to the court the role that Officer Max will play in these proceedings?" Officer stood and addressed the judge formally, explaining Officer Max's training, certification, and the documented effectiveness of courtroom support dogs in helping traumatized child witnesses. Judge Harrison listened carefully, occasionally nodding as he absorbed the information. "Very well," the judge finally said. "I am familiar with this program and support its use in cases involving young children who have experienced trauma. Officer Max may remain present throughout these proceedings. In fact, I believe his presence may serve an important function in ensuring that this young witness can provide her testimony with the minimal trauma possible." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The judge's approval of Officer Max's presence was a significant victory, signaling his openness to creating conditions that would allow Emma to speak her truth. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Harrison settled back into his elevated chair, his expression grave and contemplative. The morning had been consumed by testimony, Emma's brave words, the cross-examination that had challenged but not shaken her account, and various other witnesses including Sarah, police officers, and doctor. The afternoon had been dedicated to legal arguments from both ends, each presenting their interpretation of the evidence and advocating for their client's position. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture that suggested he had been moved deeply by what he had witnessed. He looked directly at Emma, who sat between her mother and Officer Max in the gallery. The dog's presence in the courtroom had continued throughout the afternoon, a constant source of emotional support and grounding for the traumatized child. "This has been one of the most significant cases I have presided over in my 28 years on the bench," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of his authority and his evident emotion. "The evidence before me is clear, consistent, and deeply troubling. This child has demonstrated remarkable courage in testifying about traumatic events that she witnessed at an age when many children can barely communicate their basic needs." The judge paused, his eyes moving between Emma and Officer Max. A faint smile touched his lips, a rare expression on his typically stern face. "I want to acknowledge," Judge Harrison continued, "the extraordinary role that Officer Max has played in these proceedings. This dog has provided emotional support and grounding that has enabled a traumatized child to access her voice and speak her truth. The presence of this animal has demonstrated something I believe all legal professionals should understand. Sometimes justice, requires us to look beyond traditional courtroom procedures and recognize that the most vulnerable members of our society need unconventional support systems to ensure their voices are heard. Squeezed Sarah's hand, and Sarah felt hope surge through her chest. The judge's words suggested his verdict would be favorable. Based on all evidence presented, including the testimony of this brave young child, the evaluations of mental health professionals, and the documentation of events provided by law enforcement, I make the following findings of fact. Michael engaged in domestic violence that was witnessed by his 3-year-old daughter. The violence was severe, frightening, and has caused documented psychological trauma to the child. The mother, Sarah, acted appropriately to protect her child and has demonstrated consistent devotion to her daughters and recovery. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a decisive sound that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom. I hereby award full legal and physical custody of Emma to her mother, Sarah. Visitation rights for Michael are suspended pending completion of court-ordered anger management counseling, domestic violence rehabilitation programming, and psychological evaluation. Additionally, Michael is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $800 per month, with a portion of those funds designated for Emma's ongoing psychological treatment and therapy. The judge made another notation on his document before continuing. Furthermore, Judge Harrison said, his voice becoming even more authoritative, I want to place on the record my strong support for the Riverside County Courthouse Support Dog Program. Officer Max's presence and exceptional work in this case exemplify why such programs are vital to our legal system. I am recommending that this program be expanded and that similar programs be implemented in courthouses throughout the state of Colorado. The documented benefits for child witnesses cannot be overstated. Officer stood and inclined his head respectfully toward the judge. Judge Harrison returned the gesture, a moment of mutual professional respect that seemed to acknowledge the importance of what had transpired in his courtroom. Sarah collapsed against, tears of relief and gratitude flowing freely. Her daughter was safe. The court had recognized the truth of Emma's experience and had protected her from further contact with the man who had terrified her. The future suddenly seemed filled with possibility rather than fear and uncertainty. Emma, seeing her mother's tears, climbed down from her seat and wrapped her small arms around Sarah's neck. Officer Max moved closer, resting his head against both mother and daughter in a gesture of comfort and celebration. Even in the formal courtroom, the sight of the dog embracing the family he had helped protect seemed to acknowledge the profound emotional reality of what had been accomplished. 6 weeks later, the small park near their home was filled with the sounds of children playing, birds singing, and the gentle rustle of spring leaves. Emma, now noticeably more relaxed and animated than she had been months earlier, ran through the grass with a lightness and freedom that Sarah had feared might be lost forever. The nightmares had become less frequent, occurring only once or twice a week instead of every single night. Emma's appetite had improved dramatically, and she had begun to engage with other children at her, forming tentative friendships and showing interest in activities and games. But the most remarkable change was in Emma's overall demeanor. The withdrawn, fearful child who had been unable to make eye contact or trust adults had gradually transformed back into something resembling the cheerful, curious toddler she had been before the trauma. The transformation wasn't complete. Doctor had explained that healing from early childhood trauma was a long-term process, but the progress was undeniable and remarkable. Officer Max visited twice a week, and these visits had become the highlight of Emma's week. The dog had become her most trusted companion, her bridge between the fear of her past and the hope of her future. Emma had learned to read Officer Max's body language, to understand that the dog's presence meant safety and support. In turn, Officer Max had become deeply bonded to Emma, seeming to view the little girl as someone special who required his protection and devotion. During their visits, Emma and Officer Max would play in the park, with the girl throwing tennis balls that the dog would retrieve with enthusiastic energy. Officer watched from a nearby bench, smiling at the interaction between child and dog. He had recommended that the courthouse continue Emma's connection with Officer Max, recognizing that the bond they had formed was therapeutically valuable and should be maintained. "Thank you," Sarah said to Officer one afternoon as they sat watching Emma and Officer Max play. "I don't have words to adequately express how grateful I am for what Officer Max did for Emma. I don't know if my daughter would have found the courage to testify without him." Officer smiled warmly. Officer Max is an exceptional dog, but what he did for Emma speaks to something deeper than training. He recognized a kindred spirit, a young being who was suffering and needed help. That recognition, that capacity for empathy and connection, is something that can't be trained. It's something that exists in the heart. Sarah watched her daughter laugh as Officer Max playfully pretended to chase her through the grass. The sound of that laughter, genuine, unself-conscious, full of childish joy, was perhaps the most healing thing Sarah could have witnessed. Emma had survived her trauma. More than that, she was beginning to thrive. 3 months later, Judge Harrison stood in front of a conference room filled with legal professionals, law enforcement officials, and legislators. He was presenting the findings of a comprehensive study on the effectiveness of courtroom support dogs in cases involving child witnesses. The data was compelling. Children who had access to support dogs more completely experienced fewer panic symptoms during legal proceedings and showed significantly better long-term psychological outcomes compared to children who had without such support. The case that inspired much of this research involved a 3-year-old child who had witnessed severe domestic violence, Judge Harrison explained to the assembled group. This child was deeply traumatized, nonverbal, and appeared unlikely to be able to testify. However, with the support of a trained dog named Officer Max, this child not only but did so with remarkable clarity and courage. That testimony led to a verdict that protected the child and ensured her continued safety. The judge displayed photographs of Emma and Officer Max, showing the dog kneeling before the child on the courthouse steps after the hearing concluded. The image had become iconic within legal circles, representing the intersection of justice and compassion, of formal legal procedures and the recognition of human and animal emotional needs. "I strongly recommend," Judge Harrison concluded, "that every courthouse in this state implement a similar support dog program. The evidence is clear. These animals save children from further trauma and ensure that justice is served more effectively." Officer Max didn't just help one child. He has fundamentally changed how we understand the role of compassion in our legal system. 1 year later, Emma's 4th birthday celebration took place in the backyard of the home she shared with her mother. Sarah had decorated the space with colorful balloons and streamers, and a small group of children from Emma's class played games and enjoyed cake and ice cream. Emma was happy, secure, and surrounded by the love and protection of people who cared deeply about her. Officer Max was present at the celebration, having become a regular fixture in Emma's life. The dog wore a special around his neck that Emma had selected, decorated with small paw prints and hearts. The bond between child and dog had deepened over the year, becoming something that transcended the initial support work that had occurred in the courtroom. Doctor observed from the edge of the gathering, satisfied with Emma's progress. The child still required ongoing therapy. Trauma healing was a gradual process, but Emma had made remarkable strides. She no longer experienced nightmares with regularity, her anxiety levels had decreased significantly, and she was developing the emotional resilience that would serve her well throughout her life. As the party wound down and other children were picked up by their parents, Emma sat quietly with Officer Max, her head resting against the dog's soft fur. She whispered something to the dog that no one else could hear, words of gratitude, perhaps, or simple expressions of love and connection. Sarah watched her daughter with her dog, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the remarkable turn of events that had led to Emma's healing. The custody hearing had been the legal beginning of her daughter's recovery, but Officer Max had been the emotional catalyst that had made true healing possible. Judge Harrison's written opinion on the case had become required reading in family law courses across the country. Law schools used it as a teaching tool to demonstrate the importance of understanding trauma-informed legal practices and recognizing the needs of vulnerable witnesses. Officer Max had become something of a celebrity in legal circles, invited to speak at conferences and to participate in professional development programs for judges and lawyers. But to Emma, Officer Max was simply her friend, her brave, loyal, compassionate companion who had knelt beside her when she was frightened and afraid, who had shown her that courage was possible, and who had helped her find her voice at precisely the moment when the world needed to hear what she had to say. As the sun set over the backyard and the celebration came to an end, Emma fell asleep against Officer Max, her small hand resting on the dog's chest, her breathing deep and peaceful. In that moment, surrounded by love and safety, Emma represented the possibility of healing, the power of unexpected connections, and the extraordinary impact that compassion, whether human or canine, could have on transforming a life that had been shattered by trauma. The story of Emma and Officer Max would continue to inspire people for years to come, reminding them that sometimes the greatest acts of justice and compassion come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes healing requires us to look beyond traditional structures and recognize the profound emotional and psychological needs of those who are most vulnerable.